Hi, everyone. I'm Marie Dorigny. I'm the Administrative Director of the Institute for Ideas and Imagination. Thanks for coming tonight. This is an evening that we are co-presenting with Columbia Global Centers that has another line of programming, and if you don't know about that, you should go on their website and sign up to their mailing list as well. I'm going to do a brief introduction of Sarah and Emlyn, and then I'll let Sarah do her presentation, and then they'll have a conversation with Emlyn. Sarah Cole is the Parr Professor of English and Comparative Literature and the Dean of Humanities at Columbia University. And in that capacity, she is a great friend of the Institute because she's the one who tells fellows who've won a fellowship whether or not they may indeed take leave and come to Paris for a year. So she's a very beloved figure at the Institute. And she's a specialist in literary modernism and the co-founder of the New Jersey Modernism Seminar and the director of the Humanities War and Peace Initiative at Columbia. She's the author of At the Violet Hour, Modernism and Violence in England and Ireland, and Modernism, Male Friendship, and the First World War, and of course the book that we're here to discuss tonight, and that's being sold with Sinead over there by the piano. And she's also a recipient of a 2014 Guggenheim Fellowship. And Emlyn Hughes, who's a current fellow at the Institute, is a professor of physics at Columbia. He specializes in atomic, nuclear, and particle physics. He's the recipient of many awards, among them several teaching awards, and was one of the physicists involved in the making of the Hadron Collider. Is that right? Yes. Yes, okay, good. I'm always scared when I talk about Emlyn because it's really not my bailiwick. Anyway, he's a current fellow at the Institute, where he's very excited to be spending the year with non-scientists, and we are in return extremely grateful for his presence and the hideous knowledge he reveals to us daily about nukes and our very sorry future. He would have a lot to say to H.G. Wells and a lot to ask as well, and I'm particularly excited that, much in the spirit of the Institute, we're here tonight to listen to a conversation between an academic and a writer and a nuclear and particle physicist. Thank you.
Thank you. Just ask for a copy of the book. I wanted to read one part of it at one point. So should I be up there so that I can advance the slides? Okay, I can stand for this part and then we'll sit down and chat. That might be the easiest. Thank you. And then I assume I just go like that. So I have a few thank yous, as you can imagine. Marie has been absolutely wonderful and fantastic, as have the rest of the Institute staff. As she says, I help on the Columbia side to a small degree, and it's been extremely heartening and encouraging to see how beautifully and generously you all do your business here. So thank you so much for hosting me, and thank you all for coming on a Friday night, which as a New Yorker, there wouldn't be one single person in this room if this were being held at Columbia, my institution, so I'm very grateful. Mark Mazauer is not here. We looked through the calendar and we discovered that from about November till May, there was not one single day when we could both be here. But he's here in spirit, and I'm very grateful to him and to the Global Center, the Columbia Global Center here. I already thanked all of you. And then above all to Emlyn for being he was maybe conscripted, but still incredibly generous to read this book and engage a conversation with me and all of you. So thank you so much. So I'm just going to present briefly about the book, give you a little bit of a sense of what it's all about, and then we'll have a conversation. So H.G. Wells is the subject, as you know. This was a very different kind of work for me. It was a challenging book to write, but also it was one that I felt, and still feel, even though it's finished now, very passionate about. I felt compelled over these years that I've been working on this book to understand and to express what I came to see as really a major, I think, missing part in our understanding of the imaginative life of the 20th century. So let me start by saying a little bit about that story. That is why I thought it was important to write a book about Wells. And then I want to say a little bit about what the book is mostly about through most of its pages. That is to say, what do we find when we actually sit down and read this prodigious and incredibly influential and interesting and sometimes troubling writer, and who wrote an absolutely massive amount, a massive corpus. So what happens when we actually dig in to that? How does that recharge or how did that recharge and reorient this entire period in literary history? So I'll talk about that briefly. And then lastly, just offer a few words about legacy so that we can think together about some of the ways that Wells continues to play a big part in our contemporary world. And I will say just from the outset, and I'll come back to this once or twice, that there are a series of disjunctions that really orient this book. And one of them really is the difference between his enormous role in the kind of popular imaginary and his very tiny role in academic English and any curricula. So just to give you a little bit of orientation in terms of the period we're talking about in literary culture, Wells was born in 1866, the same year as Yeats, if you're interested in that. Oh, sorry, I guess a year after Yeats, but that time frame. And he died in 1946, so 1 month shy of his 80th birthday. Wells was born into a class. I am not an expert on the micro-gradations of the British class system in the 19th century, but I can say that he was born into a class that represents the very, very bottom rung of the middle classes. So his mother was a lady's maid, and his father was a gardener and a shopkeeper. And his planned destiny, what he was supposed to do with his life, was to be in the drapery trade, which when he was apprenticed off at 14, he hated with an unbelievable passion. And he wrote some fantastic comic novels about that pick up on that experience. He wrote his first novel, The Time Machine, in 1895. And from then on, he wrote nonstop, really, for 50 years until right before his death. Wells led an enormously interesting life. He became immensely famous and wealthy as well. He had 2 wives, which was not typical in this time. His first divorce in the 1880s was very unusual, 1890s, sorry. He had children in and out of marriage, again, not particularly normative. He had a huge number of sexual affairs, which I really don't treat at all in this book, but if you're interested in them, you can read David Lodge's novel, A Man of Parts, whose title I think gets a little bit at that. And he was just deeply engrossed in just about everything that we might be interested in from this consequential half century in our history. If you wanted to write a cultural history of the first half of the 20th century in England and the English-speaking world via a single life, you could Wells would be a good candidate for that. That's not what this book is, but one could do that. He's lived that kind of life. And I should say up front that not everything in that life and around this person is something that I admire. There's plenty to dismay and trouble and disappoint in Wells's views on different kinds of things. And I do try to touch on that in the book. And I'll say it's been interesting. There have been quite a number of reviews, and every one of them has felt that tension about wanting to be able to think about this person and this character and this literature, but also uncomfortable about certain aspects of Wells's viewpoint and some of the positions he advocated occasionally in his writing, or as a whole in some cases. Okay, so why this book? I would say that the decision to write this book came as a kind of, not to be too literary, but a kind of epiphany, really. I had been reading modernism, more canonical figures. I'd written 2 books on more canonical figures like Conrad and Woolf and Eliot and Forster and Yeats. And I'd been teaching these people also for a long time. And another thing I'd been doing that was also important for the genesis of all this is reading and writing and thinking and teaching about war, and particularly World War I. And through all of this, I never really noticed a kind of shadowy figure in my peripheral vision, and that was H.G. Wells. It was one of those things that once I recognized him, he was everywhere in all of this, and I had to kind of go back through my whole intellectual development and realize how he had been an absent presence. Virginia Woolf regularly chooses him as her favored foil against which she can set herself and her fellow modernists, similarly with T.S. Eliot. But then Conrad dedicated The Secret Agent to Wells, and I love The Secret Agent. I've written about it and taught it, and somehow hadn't really noticed that. They had a long and very deep friendship for a while. There was an even more famous friendship and breakup with Henry James. So these are major figures in the literary life of this period who had these close and tense relations with Wells, and for whom not being Wells mattered significantly. His name came up constantly in reference to the war. I discovered at one point that I actually had quoted him in my second book and hadn't really noticed it. So he's, on the one hand, he is a major figure and force in the first half of the 20th century, and I'll say more about that, but he is precisely nowhere in the academy. It's kind of a joy as a literary scholar, any kind of scholar, to find a person like this who is simultaneously everywhere and nowhere. It makes your task really clear, if not easy. I had never read a single work of Wells's in any course I ever took in my entire educational career. My daughter's been looking at, we've been going around looking at sixth grade. Yeah, this is what you do in New York. You just apply for things for tiny grades. So we spent the whole fall looking at schools, and I decided that my criteria was going to be if I saw a Wells book anywhere, displayed in the libraries. And one of them actually had The Island of Dr. Moreau, but we're actually not going to go there, so it wasn't really my criteria, but it could have been. Anyway, I'd never read any Wells at all, and when I started this project, I'd actually only read about 5 of his books. Keep in mind that he wrote 100. But again, there was a story that I came to really clearly and with a kind of conviction. And the 1 or 2 books that I had read carefully and taught, like The Time Machine, I had loved. The Time Machine is one of those books that falls at the very end, like the last book, maybe. If there's any Wells on a syllabus, it might be the last book on a Victorian class. And in my case, the first one on a modernism survey. So what was going on here? As I've said, I realized that there was a story to tell, that something was happening, and that it was consequential for thinking about a lot of different possible issues in the 20th century. And as I launched into all this, I found that all aspects of this were way more pronounced than I had realized. As I said, Wells was absolutely everywhere. As I came to understand, he was by far the most widely read author of this period in literary history, in England and beyond England. And regularly, many of these writers, like Woolf or Orwell or many others, will talk about how Wells was the most widely read author of his and their generation. Even before The Time Machine was published in 1895, he had done other writings. He was a science writer and science journalist. And then after The Time Machine became a bestseller right away, that was it. He was off. The genre we know as science fiction, although it wasn't called that then, really came into being in the next half decade with, after The Time Machine, with The War of the Worlds, The Island of Dr. Moreau, The Invisible Man, The First Man in the Moon, and a variety of other fictions, including fantastic and interesting short stories, for which he was also very famous at the time. He then went on to write another 95 or so books, and these ranged across really any and every genre you can imagine, and many that you can't imagine, because they are strange hybrids that Wells kind of brought into being for his own purposes and didn't really have a life that has followed from them, at least in a way we can really track. But this frenetic writing career went on all the way until his death. So he wrote comic novels, social novels, realist novels, but not only novels. He was world famous as a predictor and a speculator on all matter of forecast. He wrote in the period, and mostly in the 20s and the early 30s, he took to writing massive books in the popular disciplines, history, science, and economics, including The Outline of History, which was, most of us today remember The Time Machine, The War of the Worlds, the very early science fiction, but by far his bestseller during his lifetime was The Outline of History, which sold in the millions of copies. It was a world history that began with the creation of the planet as he understood it, and went up actually not just to the present of 1920, but when it was published, but in fact into the future. And it was written with the modest goal of ending warfare forever by providing human beings with a sense of common historical beginnings and a common fate. He wrote political tracts. He wrote a human rights manifesto in 1940 that set the template for the United Nations Universal Declaration a decade later. And his books sold, as I've said, in the millions, and they were translated into many, many languages, including Esperanto. He was a big believer in the possibility of universal languages, and many others, not only European languages, but Asian languages and all around the world. He made films. He became a staple of the BBC airwaves. Wells was sought as a voice and a thinker on subjects that range from education to warfare to sex to science to time. Winston Churchill read all of his books. He wrote a letter to Wells in 1916 in which he thanked him for inventing the tank, which they had finally put into use to ultimately defeat the Germans in World War I. He had meetings with both Roosevelts while they were presidents, with Lenin and with Stalin. And with Stalin, he had a very famous interview in 1934 in which he admonished Stalin for not listening to him. It became a somewhat infamous thing, but it's kind of a fascinating thing to read. He was, I want to say, in his contemporaries' minds. He was under their skin. Above all, they saw him as a futurist and a utopian, although it's really important to note all the way along that his utopianism, which he embraced, was also always marked by a very dark and deep sense of the dystopian and the apocalyptic and endings. And to speak again of literary modernists, they all had him in one way or another on their minds. Almost all of them. Maybe you could say all, in fact. So there was a major contradiction or disjunction. The literary culture of this period completely excludes Wells in our views, but in fact, there's a way in which even in its own gestures of self-identification in the early decades of the 20th century and up to the 1920s and the 1930s and even the 1940s, writers that we have come to see as kind of critical voices and the main writers we turn to from this period all saw themselves in some kind of interesting agonistic relationship with him. I haven't really even talked about Orwell, who saw Wells as the most important writer in his own life and in the whole generation's life. And I haven't been able to prove that he chose his name Orwell because it's Orwell's, but I think it's true. And certainly 1984 was a response not only to the totalitarian states of the period, but to Wells's own utopias. So the actual literary culture of this period is very intertwined with his works and ideas. I just had this little engram thing that I asked someone in the libraries to help me with a number of years ago, just to kind of give a visual. It's not in the book because it's just ultimately probably these things are a little bit flawed. But what's interesting is just to see the blue line is H.G. Wells and the Wells line is Virginia Woolf, just to give you a visual of the references to these two writers in the Google Books archive. And you can really see exactly where they come together and then where the two lines move in the opposite direction and Woolf takes off and Wells diminishes. And the reason I wanted you just to see this graphic is because it's really, it's intuitive and clear why this would be happening in around 1955. This is really the exact moment when modernism, literary and otherwise, became, but particularly literary from my point of view, established as the appropriate and celebrated form or mode of literature in curricula, not only in England, but actually all around the colonial and post-colonial curricular scene and in the United States. And when modernism really came to determine literary taste and values. So you can see the effects of that. This is just some books. There's just a snapshot of my one small part of my library. I just think it's nice to have books in our presence, even if it's just pictures of them. So what would happen, what happens if we return to this moment in literary history and start over? If we set aside these modernist values of which many of us, I think, have been deeply schooled, and start afresh. Think about what was Wells writing? What were all these people reading in England, in the US, in Russia, in Paris and France? There were whole bookstores in Paris that were kept afloat through the selling of Wells's books. What happens to the whole of literary culture if we approach it by reading him not in exclusion of Joyce or Woolf or others, but next to them, alongside them? What kind of productive dialectic can we develop? So what I found and what I argue over the course of the book is that a great deal, in fact, changes. And I try to elaborate how things look differently if we read Wells. I'm not going to obviously summarize the whole book, but I will give you a few examples of what I see as the kind of intervention in literature and culture and politics over this critical 50 years of the first half of the 20th century that reading Wells might make. So the book is organized thematically, each chapter taking on one of the big topics that motivated his work. And throughout, I roam and rove across his massive corpus. And that's also important to me, that even though there are works like The Time Machine that are continue to be celebrated to some degree and certainly very influential in popular fantasy literature and film and so on. In fact, it's the great variety and spread of his body of work that I find so fascinating. The first chapter I just want to talk about for a minute or two because it's important to think, for me it was important to do this one first. It's called Voice, and what it does is it analyzes Wells's writing styles, his choices, his key provocations, specifically in relationship to style and form and tone and technique and the quality of his voice. And the reason I say this was so important to me in this book is that this is never, ever done. When people, even those people scholars who do read and discuss Wells, they treat his writing as a kind of transparent window through which they look to find something interesting, or worse, a kind of dull fact that they have to withstand to get to the kind of interesting meat of it all. But rather, this is obviously wrong, and his voice, I think, represents a complex and really stunning accomplishment, which brought together literally millions of readers. And when I talk about sort of languages and national, the spread of his writing across the world, I also want to draw your attention to the fact that he was read by so many different kinds of readers in any one place. He was one of the most, in all the writings that we have, all the literature we have on the popularity or the approval of writers by working class readers, Wells is always at the very top of the list. But he was also read by the political intelligentsia, and I've already mentioned his entanglement complex, say, with modernism. So how did all this happen is, I guess, in a way, the kind of challenge of this chapter and perhaps of the book. So just one sort of feature of this chapter I want to mention here is my effort to challenge the absolute doctrine of modernism, cemented by modernism, but preceding it and exceeding it, that the fiction writer should always show and never tell. Here's how Joyce put it in an unusually succinct formulation for him. He wrote at one point, I want the reader, this is James Joyce, I want the reader to understand always through suggestion rather than direct statement. And you can see how this is such a mantra for literature now. But this was not Wells's view. And his works do all kinds of didactic and, as he felt, educative work. They are, in his view, a form of education. I would add here that though I haven't used the word popular, you may have noticed that I've been using terms like widely read. And there's a reason for that, even though in some ways we can say he was enormously popular in the sense that he was read very widely. But the term popular literature usually connotes a certain kind of range or type of writing that is meant primarily to confirm rather than to challenge our understandings. Most people think of popular literature as in some way derivative or unchallenging. And I really want to stress that in no way does Wells's writing fit that bill. It is uncomfortable and it is meant to be so. His work provokes and provokes and provokes, and that is really how it was read and understood at the time. It grabbed the Victorian imagination by the throat, and it was always intended to make its readers think and to feel uncomfortable. How else, this is Wells's view, can it produce change or even revolution, which was his goal for writing? How else can it bring about the intended future that he imagined? For Wells, it always takes a war to end war, and that's true in writing as well. So that's the setting up of Wells as a voice and a kind of writer. And then after that, I have chapters that focus on large themes across his writing. The first one is on war, and it's entitled Civilian. And the argument there is that through Wells's very long career of envisioning war, including total war, which he fervently and vividly imagined well before World War I, he brought to life one kind of person, an important new figure in the moral life of the 20th century, and that was the civilian, defined in relation to war and out of war, and also as outside of its purview, inside and outside. And the civilian became, for Wells, really the ultimate casualty of modern warfare, but also, in his view, the source for challenging the world forces that lead to war. So the civilian becomes both the ultimate victim and the potential, the source, the site for the potential ultimate challenging to war as an international phenomenon at all. The chapter on time is, I guess, appropriately the longest one in the book, and it makes the case for Wells as a kind of philosopher of time, whose journeys both forward and backwards represent a genuine and a startling engagement with the meaning and the experience of temporality. So here I look at Wells's profound engagement with the future, which is, as I've already said, something that was one of his primary how he signified primarily for his contemporaries who saw him as a predictor and were constantly asking him for his forecasts on things and so forth. So I engage with that as a kind of significant and meaningful and generically fruitful way of experiencing time and the world, always kind of falling forward. But equally, I look at Wells as a historian, how he wrote and reconfigured history. And I've already mentioned The Outline of History as a major book in this interwar period that we usually associate with the big works of literary modernism like Ulysses. The last chapter, Biology, takes up one of Wells's lifelong preoccupations, which is the nature and concept of life as he thought of it. That is, organic biological life. Wells, you should know, was trained as a scientist. I mentioned already his lower class status and his hatred of and his loathing of the trade for which he was intended. By dint of a series of literal accidents and his sheer genius, he ended up with a scholarship to study at the Normal School of Science in London, which was one of the new universities founded in England and specifically in London, and this one for the training of future science teachers. And he had the immense good fortune to spend a year studying with Thomas Huxley, the great Victorian biologist and student and of Darwin's and the kind of propagator of Darwinian theory. And this studying with Huxley in particular set the stage for a half century for Wells of exploring the meaning and the consequences of essential biological facts such as evolution, waste, growth, and reproduction. And there's a lot that's troubling there and fascinating, and there are ways in which he really gets at some of the issues that continue, I think, to animate and concern us today. So these chapters are oriented around some of the big themes that run throughout Wells's work, and all along I consider his biggest idea, and the one that motivated his writing through most of his life, and that was the urgent need to end war. And conflict and inequality across the world. And Wells believed that this was possible. He believed it was possible, and he had the solution, which was to eliminate nations and forge a single world state. And I sum up this quest in the conclusion. So there's obviously much more that I could say about these chapters. I will save that for our conversation. But let me just mention a few thoughts about legacy before I wrap up here, about where is Wells now. So on the one hand, as I've said, in academia, he's precisely nowhere. But in other ways, he continues to loom enormously large if we know where to look. Most strikingly, he's here in contemporary mass pop culture, and especially in its fantasy. Time travel. I mean, even as we speak, there's a new The Invisible Man novel being, a new film version of it opening in theaters, I think today, this Friday, or maybe it's next week, the 28th. By the way, it's starring Elizabeth Moss, you know, from Mad Men and from The Handmaid's Tale. I saw an ad for it. I was watching something on TV, and I thought, wow, that looks a little like The Invisible Man, because there was something invisible that was kind of terrorizing this person. And lo and behold, it's called The Invisible Man, based on the novel by H.G. Wells, but it's really far from it. But the central idea of being tormented by this invisible person and the kind of fascinating and compelling visuals and sort of terroristic potential of that is what his novel explored, and so does this. There's also a new War of the Worlds. I have a picture on my phone. You know, I was going by the subway and the doors open. I saw this big poster for War of the Worlds. And there was just a serialized version of that as well in Britain last month. So every minute of the day, there seems to be a new Wells fiction being filmed or brought to life in some way or other. And of course, time travel, I mean, I don't think I could spoil the end of Avengers Endgame to anyone on the planet Earth, but I'll just say that time travel is important there too. But it's not just that. It's not just the presence of his plots and his kind of iconic situations. and his dystopias too. And I would say that somebody I mentioned, The Handmaid's Tale, someone like Margaret Atwood's fictions, I think, are still really engaged, if not with Wells directly, with Wellesian projects. And incidentally, if you're an Atwood fan, as I am, you may be interested to know that she is a Wellesian. She wrote a brilliant introduction to The Island of Dr. Moreau, the Penguin edition of that came out about 10 years ago. In an undergraduate course I taught a couple years ago, we had a course wiki in which whose title was Wells is Everywhere, and the assignment was to kind of find him wherever they found him. That being Columbia, people were always coming up with references in obscure German composers or anticipated in St. Augustine. But they also found what I expected them to do, which was all these resonances across pop culture, whether it's in games or comics or movies or films or TV. So he's there. But what is ultimately more compelling to me than the usually unrecognized presence of Wells, it's interesting that though he's in all these things, almost nobody knows that Wells was the progenitor of all that. So it's a kind of, again, a strange amnesia. But more compelling to me than the unrecognized or recognized presence of him there are the various roads that Wells set out on, and that we as a literary culture in general have chosen not to follow. Wells believed fervently that writing could and should change the course of history. And that seems at this point, 70 plus years into modernist sovereignty, just deeply counterintuitive. But is it? I just have one more little PowerPoint. These are two kind of tags, statements of Wells's that at the time or today continue to sort of affiliate with him. The war, this is the war that will end war. That phrase, which has a very tortured and interesting history, was Wells's, and he wrote a pamphlet by that name, The War That Will End War, in September. It was the first essays were published 4 days into the war, and the thing was published a month into the war. So very early on, helping to shape the way some people thought about what the meaning of that war could be. And then human history becomes more and more a race between education and catastrophe. And Wells saw his work and the work of other writers who chose to take this view as on the side of education and writing against catastrophe. So these are some summations, I suppose, of his aspirations. And I think they continue to say something of value to us today. So I thought I would just end by reading the last paragraph, since it's always nice to hear writerly voices when we're talking about writing. And I think it gets to some of this sense of whether and how it's meaningful to continue to think about the Wellesian project. And what about Wells the person? Do we need to extol him or believe in the direction of his work in order to be Wellesians? My answer, of course, is no. In the end, it's a way of scrutinizing, demanding, inventing, and imagining. Wells's old friend Conrad had written that he wanted above all to, quote, make you see. Wells also constructs a new line of sight, but much more than this, he offers a vista for literature, a challenge. To take a cue from Wells is to pressure ourselves to ask what our idea of a better future might be, and how, with the tools at our hands, we might seek to create it. Wells's categories and particular aspirations may not be ours, and his shortcomings are all too visible. But his work as a spur to construct one's own visions for things to come, to borrow his phrase, and to wonder what kind of writing might now be available to the imagination to launch such projects. It's both modest and immodest. Modest because one recognizes the daunting forces that stand in the way of human happiness, peace, and harmony. Wells's goals for us, Wells's goal for us, his successors. And immodest because what Wells teaches is that being one small person is really an illusion. It was Wells's view, as we know, that is, if we have read this book, that each of us is above all a member of the species or of the human race, and that each thus contributes to its longevity and prosperity. For all of his attunement to the minuscule nature of our planet in the huge realms of space and time, not to mention the scale of any one single person, still, Wells reminds us that a tiny voice might seem less infinitesimal as it ripples and sounds through a larger space and being, the world. I don't know whether my reader will be convinced that Wells is one of the greatest and most innovative writers of the century. I hope that in considering Wells's lifetime of writing, that reader, or listener, you, will feel motivated to ask of literature, what can and should it do for the world, for tomorrow? Thank you.
Are these on? Hello? Okay, good. These work. Thank you very much. Okay, let's start. I'm going to say a few words about how I know Sarah. It's kind of funny. We've really never spoken, but there are three little stories I'm going to tell you. They're quite short. One is simply, these are, I would call them, they're not interactions, they're like overlaps, in fact. We both are on a committee at Columbia, where she's one of the leaders of it, and I'm sort of way down the food chain, in which we review academic departments, and it's for the Vice President of Arts and Science. So every once in a while, this is the place we both have to be in this room, and it's a large group of people, so it's not, and it is, all the deans are there, and so it's not a small gathering. That's an uninteresting one, but one that I saw quite a bit.
Oh, you love that space.
Yeah, exactly. Okay, now for one of my most embarrassing stories, and unbelievable that she'll either know it or she'll deny it. She'll probably deny it, but okay. So I have an 8-year-old son, and he is my youngest son, so he has enormous confidence. Teachers love him, he's very good, but he has an amazing ability to blow up his parents. He can just push the button whenever he wants and just send us off. One day I was taking care of him. He actually does lots of things. He's an athlete, he's good at school, and he also plays the violin. And he plays the violin at a school that's near Lincoln Center called Lucy Moses. And I was taking him to his lesson one day. I don't even remember what he did to me, but in public he was able to just send me off. And I started screaming at him. I turned around, and who was sitting right at the table? It was Sarah. And the minute that the idea came up that I would sit here with Sarah, I told my wife, this is the person who I screamed right next to publicly, who just must think I'm the biggest jerk ever. Okay, but that's the power of my son, in fact. And then, okay, good. Yeah, she was going to say that whether she does or doesn't. So it's all right. Anyway, the third, which is good in the end. The third thing I realized, and this was really an epiphany, is that so I see my family every single day at Columbia, and probably the one other person I see more than anyone else at Columbia University is Sarah. And the reason for that is I go out every morning running. Okay, and the one other she runs every day. I can tell, or almost every day. So it's like I have passed you so many times. We're in our own little worlds because when it's before the day starts, and that's it. But it's probably true that there's no one at Columbia that I see almost every single day besides my family. So okay, these are the three overlaps. Yeah, right. And running is definitely something, I think we both do. Okay, I'm going to start with two very general questions that are actually outside the book, and then we'll start deep diving into it. One last story I should say is I spent the last 2 weeks going out to French Polynesia because of the French nuclear weapons testing program was out there, and so I wanted to see whether you could even get there is step number one. It's quite hard. And I was basically given the task, which, by the way, this is incredibly, I feel, a high-risk thing to put a physicist here when the Institute is just filled with authors who could completely sit there, but fine, this is of our style. But getting her book to me when I had shut down my Amazon Prime account was like unbelievable. I was calling Amazon. They were angry at me because I shut down the Prime because they're basically destroying all the library, all the bookstores in New York City. So we had a huge amount of work to get the book, but we finally were able to get the Kindle and the book and so on. So I did read the whole book. So this is good, in fact. And I loved it, in fact, in the end. As you'll see, it actually has amazingly a lot of relevance to what I'm doing. But okay, question number one, very simple. You dedicated this book to two people. I'm going to make you tell us a little bit about these two people.
Freddie and Anna?
Yep.
Oh, well. See if this is on. Is that working? Good. Thank you for that. I feel like we should just talk about running. And I will say, where were you when I was running on the Seine this morning when I got right off my plane and straight out into the running shoes? So I think we were supposed to meet there tomorrow. We'll meet there tomorrow.
Exactly, yeah.
That's so sweet of you to ask. Yes, my two beautiful children, who go, one of whom goes to the same school as the 8-year-old.
Yep.
And I will say that I don't actually remember that, but I am always so happy when I see someone else's child misbehaving. It's such a relief that it's not mine. So I'm sure what I thought is, oh, thank God someone else is blowing up and not me.
Exactly, yeah.
So, well, I mean, I dedicated it to them for the really good reason that, because they fill every single day of mine with joy. And so this book was also a great joy to write. But I did feel they were fellow travelers. I mean, now when I started it, I don't know, we have to do that much subtraction, but they're 10 and 15 now, so they were sort of more on the 5 and 10 range or the 3 and, 8 range. And, they, how kids are. They always make fun of you. Oh, H.G. Wells, like, they love that. But in a way, they were real partners in the way once kids at a certain age can be. And whatever it is you're doing, whether they want to be doing it with you or not, they are. Also, this was the first, as Marie kindly gave me a lovely introduction, and this is my third book, the first two of which were deeply bound up with getting tenure. That's the way it works. The first book is usually your dissertation, and the first book, and at Columbia, it's really your second book that is the basis of your tenure. Sorry, I shouldn't say that to everybody in the room, but that's a lot of it. And so those things are very connected with pleasing other people, whereas this was just my own labor of love, and therefore, it could be a kind of family event in a way that a family affair in a way that the other ones, the stress of getting the other ones done was much greater. This was not stressful to write. It was difficult, and I was busy with administration and chairing and deaning and being a mom and all that stuff. But it was also a book that I just loved writing, and so they seem like they belong there. Also, they're so cute. We could have put their pictures up. That would be much nicer than Wells's picture.
Yeah. No, thanks so much. I actually asked my son yesterday. I texted him. I have an older son, not the troublemaker, who's a ninth grader at Stuyvesant now. He went to the Columbia School. And I asked him, has he ever read an H.G. Wells book? And I was really disappointed that the answer was no. And and actually the plot you just showed, because when I was a kid, I read I read the standard H.G. Wells book when I was young. I'm much older than him, but I was surprised by that, in fact, and disappointed. It's like, how come you haven't read H.G. Wells?
It's not on any of the curricula for any of the high schools that I looked at. I mean, I would read through their English, and they all have, they're reading books that are just as hard as The Time Machine. It's not as if it's too difficult.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. No, and it's like, Stuyvesant, come on. Right. It's a good school.
Step up.
Yeah, right. So anyway, that was a little thing. I had a question. Okay, you're in Paris. You came here, and I just, as I told you, was in French Polynesia. So I just had to ask one more general question, and that is, compare H.G. Wells to Jules Verne.
Yeah, I mean,
they are separated in time somewhat, but
separated in time. They're actually quite different. I spent last summer, or the summer before, reading a whole bunch of Verne novels, which I quite enjoyed. They're very. I don't know if any of you have read any of Verne's work. It's fascinating. Wells was an avowed revolutionist in his thinking. And so the presence of scientific discovery or of the possibility of thinking in new ways was always connected to deeply troubling and fantastical possibilities. I think that in that sense, when Verne, there's a kind of canonical statement of Verne when he was asked about Wells, and he said, him, il invente, he invents. And that's a badge of honor, obviously, for people who like Wells. But I think what he's getting at that is not just that the scientific stuff is a little questionable, but rather that it's pushing a different set of envelopes. Verne is much more of a mid-century writer in terms of the way his plots function in a context of a different imperial worldview, for example. But so they're just very different writers. But also, I think that, I think that Wells has a way of distilling in each individual novel, well, whether it's a scientific fantasy or not, there's something driving him. And that thing is what kind of motivates and is the engine for these often explosive, intensive, often very suspenseful stories. And even his longer books. The Outline of History is 1,200 pages long, and I couldn't put it down. I realize I'm an unusual person in that regard, but it's really a page-turner. I think that Verne is much more interested in kind of elaborating around the full spectrum of these spaces or journeys or whatever that he's undertaking. So the experience of reading them is, to my mind, quite different. But I love Verne, and I think my thinking for a next book project about, and maybe we'll talk about some of these things, about futurity and how and why people have attempted to think about the future in different ranges and with different aesthetic consequences and with different motivations and kind of political agendas. And I think that, I don't know if there would be anything on Verne in particular there, but trying to look at how at different historical moments and spaces, these kinds of potentialities have become the stuff for imagination is something I think is a broader question. So in that sense, they can be allies rather than competitors.
I see. At the time, were they competitors or viewed
well,
as
Verne
a
is
little...
earlier. As I said, people always compared Wells to Verne, which he didn't much like. People always compared Wells to lots of writers, which I find interesting. Most often he's compared to Dickens. That's by far the largest sort of comparison point that you find. But he's compared to other Victorian novels. He was compared to Verne. It depends really on the genre.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay, good. So I don't have a copy of your book. By the end, I will grab one.
There's one over there.
I know.
We can pass it around. It's a fetish object.
Because I had a Kindle, remember?
Oh, right.
Yeah, right. But I had a couple of questions. Now I'm going to start digging in a little bit on the issue of the modernist. And what I have to really preface this by saying I am so ignorant of all this that this was a learning experience for me to read that book on that side. When you were talking about things having to do with the end of species, that I'm very much
There's your bailiwick.
that's very much something I'm thinking about pretty much every day with the nuclear weapons stuff. But so I had two things I wanted to ask you about the modernist issues, and I'm going to read from your book just like a couple of sentences. One I think I understand, and I want to check it so that okay, did I get this right like a little kid? And then the other one I don't understand at all. So okay. I'm gonna but they're both relevant to the modernists, and they're quotes from your book. So this first one's a little bit long. First, you read a quote from Eliot, and I'm going to read it out loud. It's not that long though. The poet must become more and more comprehensive, more elusive, more indirect in order to dislocate, if necessary, language into meaning. And then you followed with the following sentence. Formal experimentation is confusion, illegibility, erudition, streams and strands of consciousness, a basic decentering of the reader, an immersion into multiple sensory worlds, a surrendering of mastery. These are some of the hallmarks and joys of reading modernism. So I think I understand what that's saying. There was this conflict between Wells and modernism. You say several times throughout the book that Wells is often viewed as a journalist. So he's communicating, directly in some sense. The modernists were basically more like poets, or more like they were trying to. I mean, it's this question of what is literature as the general topic. Is that more or less? Do I have that kind of right? That's the split between the two.
Yes,
Yeah.
I mean, well, Wells called himself a journalist, and in one of the passages one of the letters that I'm quoting from in the book, it's in a letter to Henry James. Henry James, everything, all those characteristics of modernism that Emlyn just read, pretty much could sum up the experience of reading a Henry James novel, if you've ever had that experience before. And so Wells and James had a very intense friendship that went on for about 15 years, and then they had a break. And I could explain sort of how that happened historically, but you can see in there, if you read their letters to one another, we mostly have James's letters to Wells because Wells kept all his letters, and we don't have very many of Wells's to James because James didn't keep them. So we don't see the Wells responses as much. But in any case, what you see is a dispute, a kind of gentle dispute in the letters about writing and what it should be doing. And you see James kind of slowly defending or kind of explaining, standing behind his direction in literature as against Wells's. And when the whole thing blew up, Wells wrote to James and said, I'm a journalist. And when my writing, when it's not useful anymore, it's done. And I want to say emphatically that I don't think that's true. I don't believe that Wells's writing is dated. But I do believe that he was espousing a way of thinking about what writing is doing, in which he called journalism, and by which he meant, yes, a kind of direct encounter with the reader that doesn't make the reader struggle through every sentence, and also that it was an intervention. I mean, as much as we recognize journalism as objective, journalism is in the moment, and it's there to address what's happening now, and I think in British journalism in the early 20th century and the late 19th century, to intervene in that. And Wells saw his writing as doing that. And let me just say one more thing about that, which is a really fascinating letter that we do have from Wells to Joyce, which I reproduced part of in the book, and which. So Joyce is writing Finnegan's Wake, and Wells, by the way, had been a supporter of Joyce's. He had helped him when he was in some legal trouble. He had helped with the sort of support of Joyce that many other modernists, we have letters from Pound asking Wells to help out, which he does. But in this, and he wrote a review. He was very famous, and Joyce was unknown. He wrote a very interesting review of Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man, which Joyce, it was a big deal to be reviewed by Wells. It's an interesting review to read. But in any case, in this letter, he says to Joyce, I can't follow your banner. I can't subscribe to this. You make your readers, you've turned your back, he says, you've turned your back on the common man. And, his view was, he was talking really about Ulysses in particular and the Wake, but you make readers work too hard. You've turned your back on the common man. And then he says, I would do anything to defend you against the censorship and all of that. But we've gone our separate ways. And he says, and then he has this wonderful ending. He says, but the world is wide and there's room for both of us to be wrong. I love that. But I feel that way too. And that it is a bit of a parting of the ways. But it doesn't need to be one in which only one could be remembered or embraced or seen as kind of setting a path for later writers.
Good.
And now we're going to get the part you don't understand.
Yeah, now's the part I don't get at all. So a big section of your book is on time.
Yes.
And it's the early 1900s. And even from a science perspective, time was really changing. That's when Einstein, did his theory of relativity, and then space and time are all mixed, and that probably had an impact just all over the place in literature and everywhere else. So it's the question again. I'm just probing to understand the modernists, which I think I have a feeling for now. But here's a sentence that I don't get, and it's on the topic of time, and it's about the modernists. So the modernists negotiated without ever necessarily resolving a complex array of temporal models, alternatively centered in the body, the mind, the state, the empire, the globe. So I don't.
Oh, that's a quote within a quote. Yes, I was going to say, this doesn't sound like my writing. Yes.
Okay, so, okay.
That's fine, though, because I do quote him as distilling a way of thinking about His name is
It's
Adam
how-
Barrows. It's a book about modernists and time.
Okay.
Yeah.
So it's
That's
yeah,
why it
it's
didn't
how to-
sound as good. That
Right,
sentence.
right. I'll read it again. No, it's the question of how modernists think about time, and we're talking about the early 1900s when everything's being challenged on that topic, certainly in physics, for sure.
Right.
The modernists negotiated without ever necessarily resolving a complex array of temporal models, alternatively centered in the body, the mind, the state, the empire, the globe. So
that's
okay,
so that's
just-
Adam, but that's
yeah.
fine though, because the reason I include that quote is because he does such a nice job of summarizing how critics are thinking about modernism and time.
Yeah.
He was talking a lot about the conference around the development of the meridian of Greenwich Mean Time, which, as you know, was in I think 1884. And that was really, and it was a huge sort of geopolitical moment when, presumably through a lot of British muscle,
Yeah.
I guess the agreement in almost everybody agreed to center Greenwich Mean Time as, hour zero or whatever. And so Barrows is trying to kind of historicize the way how we think about time was denaturalized, but also in that case was really politicized, was part of the larger kind of imperial moment in the European late 19th century. And his argument, which I think is one that has been made by other critics, and which is broadly true, I think, is that literary modernists were in the game too. They were also trying to ask anew about what is time, how do we experience it, how do we write it, is there such a thing as time? Modernists are known for their immersion in the sort of subjective life of the mind. And as we know, the experience of time is, on the one hand, seemingly objective. I mean, I can tell you right now that it's 8 o'clock. Time for drinks. That's another time that we can all celebrate. Anyway, I can tell you the time on my clock, and our clocks might be broadly synced, but at the same time, we've all experienced this hour very differently. And for some of you, you may have been engaged in a reverie that took you back to your childhood. That's what Virginia Woolf believed and wrote. When I teach Woolf, I like to have the students spend a little time kind of having a Woolfian walk across the campus or across Paris or whatever. What would it be like? Because each sensory experience or visual experience or whatever it may be can trigger a whole memory sequence which takes the person thinking it back or forward. And so time expands. Modernism is known for its immersion in the present, for writing whole novels like Ulysses that are set in one day, a 1,000-page novel, and Mrs. Dalloway, which was Woolf's, among other things, response to Ulysses, also set in one day. So ways of really experimenting with time. So I think that, I like my own language more than Barrows, but that's what that sort of setup is meant to be about. And I should say that for readers of modernism and readers of modernist criticism, that's very familiar. One last person to mention is the philosopher Bergson. We are here in Paris, after all, who was a huge influence, became a huge influence for literary modernists, not only in France, but particularly in England and the US. And he was very interested in the sort of very complex ways that time doesn't follow clear paths, or the way subjective time is very different from other measures of time. So these contradictions in temporality were very much on people's minds.
Good.
And as you say, also
Yeah.
following and interacting with scientists.
Yeah, no, it's true. That was a very important time period, right? For
out of it.
developing concepts of time. Let me ask one. I have so many things we're never going to get to, but let me ask one more interaction between Wells and Conrad. And Conrad has a quote which is really cute, but I do also not understand the very beginning of it. He says, Conrad's talking to Wells, and he says, "You do not care for humanity, but think that they are to be improved. I love humanity, but know they are not." Why did Conrad think that Wells didn't care about humanity? That just the first part. Like, what was the evidence for that? Because he's writing about helping the species not, go away,
Right.
go into extinction, basically.
Well, there are a couple things. In one way, Conrad is right in the sense that in his kind of global vision, Wells can be inhumane and cool. Some of the writings that disturb me, and I think all readers really today, are ones in which there's a kind of indifference to the ultimate fate of many people on the planet if and when his utopian world comes into view, which he ardently believes will be great for all people. It's not a racial, I want to be clear about that. It's not racially or class or gender. These are not hierarchies of race or class or gender. But there are different outcomes for those who do and don't participate in the utopian plan. So there is something inhumane. And I always find it really interesting that one of Wells's first novels is The War of the Worlds, which if any of you have read or seen millions and trillions of movie or TV versions of, or radio, you'll remember that the Martians are themselves the most cold and unsympathetic. That's how he describes them in his famous first paragraph. And they're just kind of systematically colonizing the planet Earth, and primarily England and particularly London and its surround. But partly there's an allegory there of how the English are going about their empire, clearly, but there are the kind of the Wellsian monsters are always a little bit like Wells, which is why so many writers are so interesting in that way, and he's certainly one of them. Yeah, but on the you think you can improve humanity, I mean, certainly, that's actually not true. I mean, Wells always said, evolutionarily, we are no different from our caveman ancestors. The red glare, is a little literary here. The caveman glares through our eyes. He did not believe, and some people wrongly think he did, that somehow we are evolving quickly, that we're going to evolve a perfect species. All of his fictions of human evolution go very dark and creepy. But he did feel that we could morally evolve and that we could evolve evolutionarily. So these are not biological forms of evolution, but they are ways of improving the world, if not our human species beings. And so Conrad was right about that.
No, that's a great answer. In fact, it makes sense because he did write things that were upsetting,
yes,
and sort of anti, let's say, about humanity. I have so many things. I want to point out one thing. There was a whole chapter in the book on civilians, basically, probably entitled even Civilian. And this one, I'll just say, is very close to what I'm doing because it was about the impact of war. Look, war and nuclear weapons are obviously completely tied topics, and a large part of this book is about war and the impact of war and how do you end of world type wars. And the Martians is, I actually had time to go back. I was so fascinated by the end of the book, I thought, I haven't read Wells since I was a kid. So I read War of the Worlds. It's so short that I could just in a day rip that off. And it really was kind of way too close to what happens if you had a world war. The Mars,
total war
it's
novel.
Exactly the same thing. And they've
got these weapons that people can't
weapons
stand up against.
So there's a large discussion in your book about the civilians and how the civilians can suffer because of war. This is very close, just to make a tie to what I've done or been working on. When the U.S. tested their nuclear weapons, they tested them in two main places. They tested them in Nevada, and they tested them in the Marshall Islands. When they were, it was, I'm sorry, evil in the way, because it was testing on humans. In Nevada, you've seen the videos, they're soldiers, okay, that are exposed to the weapon, and they run. You blow up a bomb, and the soldiers run towards the bomb, and it's an atomic bomb, and they're exposed. In the Marshall Islands, and this is what I've worked on for the last 5 years, is how exposed the land was. This was also human testing. It was bombing essentially civilians. At that point, the Marshallese are civilians. They weren't soldiers in any way. They were even supposed to be protected by the U.S. during this time. So this whole quite long discussion about how you deal with war and soldiers and civilians it's very close to what is a modern issue with nuclear weapons. And so I could go on and on for hours about that. We got to end soon. I actually had to ask the audience one thing. This is so cool. No way does anyone know this, but I'm going to ask. Does anyone know what QWOP is? QWOP. Have you ever? Do you know what QUAP is? You must know what QUAP is.
I know what it is from Wells.
right, exactly. So I didn't know what, okay, honestly, I'm a QUAP, Q-U-A-P. Okay, so honestly, as a physicist, I should know what QUAP is. And I've worked 40 years of my life, more or less in Geneva, in this particle accelerator. And QUAP, I'll now tell you, you have to look it up on Google, because that's how I found out what QUAP was. That's how we learn
everything.
Yeah, it's an antiproton and a quark as one thing bound together, which is absolutely impossible from a particle physics perspective. These things can't be bound. But what's funny is Wells takes that antiprotons we can produce, but they immediately annihilate with protons and give off energy. They are never bound to a quark. It's like impossible. But he uses it to create the most radioactive substance on Earth in Tono Bungay. And so I just thought I have to. That one's just hilarious from my perspective. Yeah. I had to bring it up, right? So it's super clever. You couldn't have something more radioactive than that. It's so unstable, it doesn't even possibly exist in nature. So it's kind of cute. Should we open up?
Yes.
I mean, because it's
super late. But I'd love to have questions if there are any, or comments or anything. Yes.
Yeah. Well, coming from a religion department, I kind of have to ask this question.
You do.
About, I mean, you said that the people are destined by their choices. So, to what extent can you see his vision, or does he see his vision as a religious vision? And what is his relationship to sort of named religions?
Yeah, I mean, that is an excellent question. We could spend the rest of the night on that. I'll just say a couple quick things. He was, I mean, he was an avowed secularist. He hated religions. In the outline of history, he elaborates a view that he also elaborated in many other texts, but it's most explicit in this long history, which again was very widely read until quite recently. And in his view, the great religious teachers of all of history, of whom he includes the Buddha and Jesus and Muhammad, these were great leaders and thinkers. And in his view, their universal teachings were immediately encrusted with the dross of religion and priests and priesthood, which he hated. So he saw a kind of collective, universal beauty in the great religious founders and a great disaster in the history of religions. So this didn't make him a lot of friends. I mentioned Huxley earlier, Thomas Huxley, who coined the term agnostic, and Wells is sort of scientific. I mean, Wells was a real believer in the power of science in kind of rational belief to bring about this utopia. So it's in kind of direct conflict with religion. That said, there are two things I want to say that complicate the picture. One is that he frequently refers to his own project as a religion. And he talks, and he had a very sort of short kind of manifesto called The Open Conspiracy, which was his, as he calls it, blueprints for a world revolution. And this was sort of meant to be a little handbook for how to start the revolution that would eliminate nations and make for a global commonwealth. And it would sort of happen by dedicated people all around the world who had had enough and who saw what World War I had brought and all the rest of it. And he frequently refers to what they would have as a kind of religion. So he's constantly invoking the name of God for his own purposes. So that's kind of interesting. And then the last thing I'll say is that there are quite a few, this is not a biography, you've probably been able to figure that out. It's really I was talking with Colm Tobin about this, a wonderful novelist, and he and I had a conversation in New York not long ago, and he said it's a biography of his works, which I thought was a nice way to put it. But Wells does have a few biographers. There are quite a few biographies out there. And one of them that's written by Jean and Norman Mckenzie together, and they believe that Wells's utopia is a clear secularization of his mother's kind of evangelical New Jerusalem religiosity that Wells grew up, chafing against, but they see this as a kind of clear return to his mother's Christian vision, but in secular trappings. So I think it's a pretty interesting set of stories there. Yeah, in the back.
Thank you. First, let me thank you. It's been extremely interesting. And also, I'd like to say that my own background is even further away from yours, in that I'm a retired mathematics professor. And I read Time Machine, and I think War of the Worlds when I was a kid, which was many years ago, as you can see. I also read Orwell and The World. But I have not reread them since. But there was another author who wrote some similar books, which I really liked, and it might even fit in, C.S. Lewis, Out of the Silent Planet. So it was about a little later, but you compared him with Orwell and things like that. So and C.S. Lewis, as I understand, was a very devout
Yes.
person. So I was wondering if there's any connection there, you can make some remarks.
Yeah, I mean, I would have to think about that one. I read all the Narnia books when I was a child, and then I reread them with my son back when he would let me read to him. So it's now getting to be quite a few years ago. I mean, those, they're not only allegories.
But I'm thinking Out of the Silent Planet.
Yeah, I haven't read that, so you'll have to tell me. Yeah, I should read that, maybe on my futurism project. But I do think that, I mean, you didn't mention Tolkien, but I've thought about Tolkien as well, partly because I'm interested in another future project that I'm sort of mulling is thinking about invisibility as a kind of consistent fantasy and strange proclivity that cuts across, for example, warfare in the form of the dream of stealth, for example, which is age-old. But then also, it's so interesting to me that in these incredibly elaborate worlds like Tolkien and Rowling create, the simple invisibility, they keep coming back to this very central, simple magic that is a kind of haunting fantasy. But I think that I have to read, I should read your Lewis novel. I do feel as if a lot of these mid-century novelists were, and later, contemporaries with Wells and slightly later, they all read him and learned from him, and they sort of go off in different directions. I mean, there's a really interesting critical book from the 1960s or so, when people were still writing about Wells and the anti-utopians, of whom Orwell is a major one. And that the contention there is that they're all these anti-utopias are engaged with Wells, obviously. That's the basic title. It may not be the exact title. But some of these other complex fantasy novelists, it may be less of sort of a straightforward for and against. And in fact, even with someone like Orwell, that's not particularly true either. I mean, 1984 is a book I've thought a lot about. I've taught and read, and I wrote a little piece on Wells and Orwell and The Dictator this past summer. And so I tried to get into what was going on there. And in the end, it seems to me that it's much more interesting to think of Wells and Orwell as each deeply kind of engaging with a series of questions around the individual, totalitarianism, and the future, than simply seeing Orwell as, attacking Wells or critiquing Wells, which he was also doing. So that doesn't really answer your question about Lewis, but Debrash, did you have your hand up? Yeah, and then.
Sure. I mean, I had two questions. Maybe I'll just ask the first one because I think it connects up a little bit with what Kathy was saying. So given that this is writing in the first half of the 20th century and some of the British context that I do know, what is A.G. Wells's, and because today is also 172 years of the publication of the Communist Manifesto. So what is Wells's relation to Marxism, and not only in terms of thinking class,
Right.
Metaphorically or directly, but also in the early Marx's thinking about species being, because you use species being specifically
Right.
as a phrase towards the end of your conversation.
Yes.
Is there anything there that one could think with?
Yeah, I mean, Marx on species being, you have to educate me a little bit more on what you mean by that. But let me just answer a little bit more superficially, Wells, I mean, it's so interesting today, as I keep mentioning these reviews, because I'm slightly obsessed with them, the parts of Wells that we associate with being right-wing and authoritarian or totalitarian or whatever it may be, they don't quite line up that way politically in Wells's own time. And he saw himself as a socialist. He was very engaged with the Fabians for a while till he broke with them. He always breaks with everyone. That's part of the pattern. He has these deep, intricate things, and then he writes these scathing things in public, and he wonders why people are mad at him. But what's interesting is how many people forgive him. I mean, it's if you were doing that kind of a reading of him, it's really quite stunning. But anyway, he saw himself always as a socialist, but he saw himself as an anti-Marxist. He didn't believe in class warfare. He didn't like Marxist structures. He thought that Marxist thinking had done a lot of damage. And he's very overt in critiquing Marx in different places, including in the Outline of History. But of course, things are never particularly simple if they're interesting. I mean, he was very, very interested in Russia. He wrote a book called Russia in the Shadows. He spent a lot of time in Russia. His books were translated into Russian. He was very prominent in Russia. He had a lover for a number of years who may have been a Soviet spy. Interesting stuff. I'm telling you, his life was totally fascinating in addition to his books. And he had these meetings with Stalin and so forth. And he was an initial, when the British public turned completely against, in a kind of hysterical way, against the revolution, Wells was stood firm in supporting and being interested in what was going on. I mean, eventually it became impossible to do that. But he loved 5-year plans and things like that. This is the kind of planning. So he was interested in the way the Soviet Union developed, and ultimately, like everybody else, lost faith with it and became horrified. But I think the idea of rethinking the world on a big scale and trying to put it into place with a kind of dedicated, in his case, they have to be kind of peace-loving, selfless technocrats. These people that don't exist, that he thought would be the leaders of his utopia. So there was some of that there. So there's a kind of kindredness in all of that as well. On the species being, I'm not sure I know what particular, and then the Communist Manifesto, I was just rereading Martin Puckner's book, which is so brilliant, on the Communist Manifesto, because I'm teaching a class right now. We had on war and various people, including Wells and Woolf, and we had a couple classes on manifestos. And Wells wrote quite a few what we could call manifestos. And that gets back to the kind of journalism thing, that he was really willing to think about literature in an expansive form, not necessarily the aesthetic manifesto, but the political one. So, in that sense, he's kind of in the tradition of, or in the game with, the most famous of all manifestos, really, which was the communist one. Yeah.
So my question actually is connected to the Bashir's question. It's about what Wells's theory of inequality was and how it connected up toward to the utopias. I mean,
Right.
He wasn't a Marxist, but I mean, the Time Machine is a kind of a Marxist dystopia, and it's really very much about inequality.
Right.
And I'm just curious as to how that, and of course there were Marxist theories of warfare.
Yes.
And I don't know if his theory of World War I was connected to, Marxian theories, but, and then he has these utopian ideas. So in some sense, maybe he resolved in some sense this problem of inequality, but I don't know how he did that. So I'm just trying to.
Yeah, I don't think he really does resolve it, because there's always someone who doesn't want to participate, and the utopia isn't fully voluntary. It may be in the best interest of all of us, but what if I don't think it's in my best interest? I mean, in an early stage, my sort of working title for this book wasn't Inventing Tomorrow, but the Wells era, which for those of you who are scholars of modernism will recognize a famous landmark book in literary scholarship called the Pound era. And so there's kind of playing around with that. And I got rid of it for a lot of reasons, but very memorably, my dear friend and colleague, Jack Halberstam, I was presenting on some of the Time chapter, but I'd framed it a little bit in terms of the sort of overall Wellsian project. And he said, I don't want to be part of the Wells era. And he's a queer theorist. And, I see that, it's not, it's for everyone and not for everyone, and that's a problem, and it's always going to be a problem. And again, this kind of dark side, I mean, he describes when he was writing he wrote an autobiography, which by the way, everybody read as well. I mean, really a total bestseller. Everybody that we know from this period read it. But anyway, he describes biking around the area, outside of London where he set the War of the Worlds and finding convenient places for his Martians to destroy. And that sort of delight in destroying his fellow people was something that, plays into these total war, works in a really vivid way. But all that said, even without being a Marxist, he grew up, as I've mentioned, on the lower class, like right there right on the verge of the abyss. And English class privilege was something that he loathed. One of his early socialist essays is called "The Misery of Boots," and it starts with him in his kind of basement where he grew up, like in the house where he grew up, where in England, like in London nowadays, these flats, you couldn't afford them, but the idea that you would see people's feet walking by is kind of the ultimate lower class status, and that's where he begins, by the kind of parade of shoes that go by. And I would love that, since I love shoes. But it's a different essay I would probably write. But in any case, he was deeply motivated to solve the problem of class inequality. So that is a true motivation for his writings. War, like many of his contemporaries, he saw war as the biggest threat. The way climate change is for us, so war was for mid-century, I think it's fair to say, up through and after World War II, and then into the Cold War. So this is not his alone. But these things were deeply intertwined in his view, and he talks a lot about the arms race and the profiteering, that he felt, one of his key requirements coming out of, or even into, in fact, World War I, was that there should be no profit making in arms manufacture. It should be entirely in states' hands and deeply, profoundly regulated. And so the ways in which capitalism breeds war, which, as you point out, is also a Marxian philosophy, is one that he thought a lot about, although he had his own views, and he had his whole thing on energy, and I'm sure you read those parts with either interest or comic, and maybe you thought this is so crazy. I feel like we should probably let
wrap
people
it up.
Have their Friday night.
Well, thank you so much. If you read this book, you're going to want to read a whole bunch of Wells books, so just be aware of that. That's the
Thank you, Emlyn.
Yeah,
So-
bye.